I really want to sew a shirt. But having spent all my pocket money last weekend on peanut butter chocolate cake, I lack the liquidity, shall we say, to buy a pattern. What I don't lack though are the tools for drafting one myself. So that's what I'm gonna do. And if you're in a similar predicament, or if you just finally want a pattern based on your measurements alone, then you can follow along and join the pattern party. First things first, we're gonna need to take some measurements. 8 of them to be exact. Now for about half of these, it's not really going to be possible for you to do it properly if you're taking them by yourself, on yourself. So if the pattern's going to be for your own use, it's best to recruit someone to help you with the measuring tape. Unfortunately, my usual recruit is at her, job. You just can't get the staff nowadays, can you? But I'll do my best by myself to show you the general areas, and I think it should be clear enough what it is you need to do. Okay, so what do we want? You're going to want your measuring tape, obviously, and you're just going to want to make sure that you, or whoever the pattern's for, is wearing something, but not anything too bulky or intrusive. That's why I took that shirt off. It's a little bit baggy, just gets in the way a little bit. So first off, we're going to take the chest measurement. So yeah, wrap the measuring tape around your chest at the widest point, and also making sure that you're accounting for the shoulder blades at their widest point at the back as well. Make sure it's snug but not overly tight. And yeah, once you're confident all that width is accounted for, that's your chest measurement. And next we're going to do our sleeve or our side depth. This is basically just going to decide how low down the armhole is going to go. So with a second tape or just a tape or a bit of string, whatever it is, wrapped around your chest in this manner at whatever height you feel like the sleeve hole should come at, and this may or may not correspond to the chest measurement height you've just taken. So with that tape or string or whatever in place, you're going to take your actual measuring tape, start at this sort of bone here at the nape of the neck, and measure directly down from there to the midpoint of the back at the level of this tape or string, and whatever the distance is between there and there, that is your side depth or your sleeve depth. 2 out of 8, we're doing well. And now we want to do our back neck to waist measurement. So I'm talking here not about your trouser waist, but your natural waist or like your belly waist. So in my case, it's kind of pretty much at the height of my belly button. This would be kind of like my natural waist. And so starting at that same nape point again, that same bone at the back of your neck, you're going to measure down again, directly down along your back to wherever that waistline is. And that is your back neck to waist measurement. Okay, so now we have the half back. This is probably gonna be a bit filier to show, so just bear with me. First things first, you're gonna start at that same nape neck bone point there, and you're gonna measure directly down 15 centimeters this time. Let's imagine that's there. You're gonna end up somewhere in the middle of your upper back, sort of between the shoulder blades. And then from that point, you're gonna measure horizontally outwards towards your arm, pick an arm. And you're gonna measure from that central point there to the point where your back ends and your arm begins. So that's gonna basically decide how wide is the back panel of your shirts. I can't really see what I'm pointing to, but I can roughly feel it. So it's gonna be like there, whatever the horizontal distance is between that point and that central back point there, that we measured down 15 centimeters to find. Like I said, a bit fiddly that one, but hopefully the point came across. So now for the neck size, you're just gonna measure around the base of your neck. If you're wearing a microphone, be sure to avoid it. Again, snug, but not tight. Now, because your neck will likely taper as it goes up, the measurement that is reading on the upper edge of the tape measure here will probably differ from whatever's reading on the bottom, even if by only a little bit. In any case, you want the reading that's on the bottom, at the base of your neck, where the neckline of the shirt is actually gonna go around. So in my case, for instance, it was like 45 centimeters. Now time for the sleeve length. So you would take the tape measure and put it at the shoulder bone there, at the top of the arm of whoever you're measuring for, and just measure the length of the arm down to just below that wrist bone here. And that's that. And now we want an actual wrist circumference measurement. Literally, take the tape measure, wrap it around your wrist, just above the wrist bone this time, and yeah, that's your wrist circumference. Again, snug, but not overly tight. Now lastly, you want a garment length measurement. Now this of course is a matter of style, maybe you want a standard tuckable work shirt, or maybe you want to wear it untucked and therefore maybe have it a little bit shorter, a little bit higher up towards the trouser waistline. Maybe you want a rounded hem, maybe you want a straight hem, a jagged hem, a cropped hem. I don't know. That's your business, and I wish you all the best in reaching your decision. So I actually like the length of this shirt that I've been wearing, and as you note though, the back is actually longer than the front, and that's just to help cover the tushy while you're tucking it in, but not leave so much excess around the front, because there are some other things going on there that it gets uncomfortable in that same case. Now when I draft the pattern, I'm actually going to start with one fundamental block that I'll then spin out into both the front and the back panels, but again, the main template for that is going to be the same thing. And in the process of drafting the pattern, I'm eventually going to differentiate between the front and the back panels by making the back panel, as in this case, or similar to this case, 5 centimeters longer than the front. So I'm going to kind of go backwards in this case. Now I know I like the 80 centimeters on the back. I'm going to take that 80 centimeters minus the 5 centimeters I'm going to re-add back on later to give me a 75 centimeter length at the front, which again is going to be the starting measurement for that base block that I'm going to use. It's maybe a bit circular, maybe a bit counterintuitive. I don't know, whatever. It makes sense like that to me. You do you, each to their own, live, laugh, love. Anyway, that's our measurements. So let's get drafting. All right, let's get down to it. And just before I start, I just want to say a word about this. This is the book I'm using to draft this pattern and indeed all the patterns I've drafted, including, you know, some trouser and suit jacket patterns in the past. It's a really great book. It's relatively affordable and it's quite technical, but also pretty accessible, I think, in the grand scheme of things. So if you're interested generally in getting into drafting your own patterns for menswear, then it's something I can definitely recommend. Anyway, off we go. Right then, so I've just got my big roll of paper from my local art supply store. You can use whatever you want. You can use transparent pattern paper, tracing paper, whatever you got, whatever works. Just weigh that down on that end. And so, start off, just gonna mark a sort of central 0.0 here. That's just gonna be my absolute foundation. I'm gonna take this fancy piece of machinery here and just square away from that in both directions. So kind of at a right angle. Again, you can just use the edge of your ruler if you don't have one of these, or just anything that has a right angle basically. And yeah, I'm just leaving a little bit of clearance at the top just in case I want or need that later. All right then. Okay, and now from 0 down to 0.1, that's just gonna be 3 centimeters. There we go. And so the distance between 0.1 and 2 is just gonna be the side depth that we worked out before, plus 4 centimeters. So in my case, that's 22 centimeters plus 4 is 26, if my math is correct. And I think it just might be. All right then. 0.2. Now I wanna do 0.1 to 0.3, and that is gonna be the back neck to waist measurement that we took. In my case, 42 centimeters, yoink. And then one more point along this line is gonna be 0.4, who would have guessed it? And that is gonna be a distance of 75 centimeters from 0.1, because that again is the garment length that I'm going for. My ruler's not that long, but if that's 42, I guess I need another 33. There we go. There's a few cardinal points. I'll just mark them a bit more clearly. And now I just need to square away in this direction, as I did with 0.0, from points 2, 3, and 4. Again, if you don't have these kind of rulers, there's also like a sort of hip curve style one I'm going to be using at some points. If you don't have them, it's really not the end of the world. You can definitely get by without them. They're just sort of useful to have. Find something with a right angle, find something with a round edge. Do what you got to do. It's all going to be good, I promise. Now, who can guess which number is coming next? That's right, it's number 5. I'm going to find number 5 by measuring along this perpendicular line running across from 0.2, and the distance away is going to be, let's see, it's a quarter of your chest measurement. In my case, my chest measurement was 106 centimeters, so divided by 4, that is 26.5, I'm pretty sure, plus then 6.5 centimeters. So give me like 10 minutes and I'll tell you what that is. Okay, I've had a conference and we've established it's 33 centimeters. Oh, right on the edge. It's 0.5. So I'm going to square it from 0.5 to 0.6 on that initial line that I squared out to 0 from, or from 0 to. Now that I've got that set, do it this way. And again, just going to mark these respective points. So 0.6 up here, 0.7 here, and 0.8 down here. I'll just sharpen those up again for you. All right, now it's getting funky. So we want to draw 0.9, and that is going to be along a line we're going to do in this direction from 0.1. And it's going to be a distance of 1/5 of my neck measurement plus 0.5 centimeters. So what's that going to be? My neck size is 45 centimeters divided by 5. That's, okay, that was actually pretty easy. That's a 9. I'm sure people screaming it at the screen. So 9 centimeters plus 0.5. That is 9.5 centimeters. That's just here. And then from here, I'm just going to square up to 0.10 back on this original line coming away from 0. So that's also just that 3 centimeters away, or should be. Looks like it's grown a little bit. For some reason, I'm in a bit of a hurry. I recommend that you don't be, but whatever. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this ruler here to draw a nice sort of natural curve from 0.10 to 0.1. So that's actually an important line. Draw that in with a big pen so you can see. Congratulations, folks. I've already made the first mistake of the day. I forgot a crucial step, which is that obviously what we got here is some seam allowance here. So there's seam allowance not fitted in everywhere into the pattern. I'll explain where it isn't as and when. But for now, what we need to know is that this is going to roughly correspond to the shoulder seam. And in the drafting of the pattern, there is already some seam allowance factored in there. I don't want the curve going up into the seam allowance. I want it to start where the seam allowance begins. And the seam allowance in this pattern is 1 centimeter as standard. Again, you can expand that later if you want. But so where this curve should have gone is not from 10 itself, but from a point 1 centimeter below 10, which again corresponds to where the seam allowance would actually begin. So let's try this again, shall we? There we go. That's more like it. So I'm sorry for the confusion. Maybe that helps. Probably it doesn't. Oh dear me, you get the idea. Now we're marking on point 11, which is halfway between 1 and 2, which is 13 centimeters. And you probably guessed it, we're gonna square out from there. It's gonna be some ugly grooves in the table after this, I think. And now then along this line, coming from point 11, we're gonna mark on the half back plus 5 centimeters. So my half back was 23 centimeters plus 5, 28. Bish, bash, bosh. Job done. There we go, point 12. And then from point 12, I'm going to square down and up to point 13 on the side depth line and point 14 up here on the very top line, you know, the sort of shoulder seam line. So now let's go get point 15, and that is going down again along this central line from point 1 at a distance equivalent to your side depth divided by 8, so 1/8 of your side depth plus 0.3 centimeters. So in my case, that is, well, 22 divided by 8 is 2.75 plus 0.3. Let's just call it 3 centimeters. Except it's not plus 0.3 centimeters, it's minus plus 3 centimeters. So let's call it 2.5 centimeters. So let's say point 15 is actually here. And again, we're going to square out from here to point 16, which specifically is falling on this line between points 14, 12, and 13. I'm impressed that I've already managed to make 2 mistakes. So carrying on along this line, running from 15 to 16, we're going to mark point 17, and that is going to be 1.5 centimeters further along from point 16. And then I'm just going to join with a straight line, point 17 and point 10. And if you can see now, kind of imagine that's going to be the shoulder line, the shoulder seam. Okay, so now to create the armhole, I'm going to connect point 17, 12, and 5. I'm going to connect those points in a curved line. Now again, in my case, I have this snazzy curved ruler. You may have something similar. If you don't stress too much about it. Just try and achieve a relatively natural curving line. You know, you don't want this to be very sharp. You don't want this to be very sharp. Just, you know, have it come around here. Even if you have to sort of freehand it, I promise it's not going to be the end of the world. Something like that. So there's just one more line to draw now, and it's going back where we started. It's point 18, again, who would have thought it? And it's going to go from point 1 down to along on this line, and the distance is going to be, again, that 1/5 of the neck measurement, which in my case was 9 centimeters, but minus 2 centimeters. And this is just going to determine the front neckline. So what we've drawn here so far is actually the back neckline. But as I said, this block is going to form the basis of both the front and the back panels. So I need to mark on the differing necklines for both of those pieces. So yeah, again, 7 centimeters down from here. That's very sing-song, wasn't it? Okay, 18. And then, as before, just curving up, not to point 10, but to that seam allowance point just below it, 1 centimeter below it. And again, just trying to find a nice natural curve here. Okay, so that is the completion of the main body block, basically one of the 2 blocks that we're going to be constructing for this pattern. So I'm just going to mark on what you actually need to be looking at here, and yeah, then we'll move on to the sleeve. And again, it'll be a bit clearer as we go how this relates to the eventual pattern. Okay, so as far as the body of the shirt is concerned, this is what you need to be worried about. So what have we got here? Obviously that's the armhole, that's the shoulder seam, that's the central seam, if you like, although on the back there won't actually be a seam. That's the bottom, that's the side. And here we have, again, the front neckline, and here we have the back neckline. So again, we'll leave that for now. I'm going to take care of the sleeve block, and then after that, we'll spin this out into the actual pattern pieces that we need. Okay, let's work with this. Waste not, want not. Again, we'll take a 0.0. Just want to leave enough room here for what I'm going to do later. To the shirt block still. And again, just sort of squaring across in both directions there, away from 0.0. There's a 0.0. And now we want to mark a 0.1, and that is going to be down from this line. It's going to be 1/3 of the distance between 1 and 2 on here, which was, if memory serves, 26 centimeters. Yep, so what's that divided by 3? I have no idea. It is 8.6 something, I think. Yep, 8.666 reoccurring. Let's just call it 8.5 centimeters down. That's going to be 0.1 for the sleeve. And again, we're going to square across. And I'll make sure to finish that line down there as well. Okay, so we now want to find point 2, and it's going to be along this line, and that is going to be the sleeve length that you measured minus 2 centimeters. So in my case, that's 63 centimeters minus 2 is 61. So that's point 3. I misspoke, that's point 4. Anyway, now to find the real point 3, will the real point 3 please stand up? It's going to be along this line here, going perpendicular out of point 1, and that is going to be equal to the, if you go back to your body block and measure a diagonal line between 0.5 here and 0.17 here, so that's 23.5 in my case. So point 3 is going to be along this line, that same distance plus another 3 centimeters, so 26.5 centimeters. Just going to make it a nice efficient use of paper there. Okay, so now we need a point 2, and that is coming along here at what is going to be sort of the cuff of the sleeve, and that is going to be a distance of half of your wrist measurement plus 5 centimeters. So my wrist measurement was, what was it? 18, so 9 plus 5, 14 centimeters. Easy peasy. There's your point 2, and then we're just going to join points 2 and 3 on their little diagonal. A little bit of help. Going to draw a diagonal line between point 0 and 3 on the sleeve, and I'm going to measure that distance and divide it into 5 points. So what have we got? 28 centimeters. What is that? 5 point something? 5.6 centimeters. So every 5.6 centimeters, just mark. I think that's correct. And that's points 5, 6, 7, and 8. And obviously we need a curved line ideally that is going to match the curve of the armhole itself. And these are going to help us create that. But we don't want it to be an even curve. It needs to be sort of variable, if you like. And this is how we're going to do it. So measuring out perpendicularly along this line from 0.5, we're going to go down or into the sleeve 0.75 centimeters. So just mark a little point there. Don't worry about numbering it. And then here, halfway between points 7 and 8, so, you know, whatever, 2.75, around there, we're going to do the same, only going upwards, and this time it's going to be 1.5 centimeters. So again, there's our 2 points, there and there. And what we're then going to do is draw a sort of continuous curved line from 3 through that point, through 6, through that point, and back to 0. And that is going to form that nice curved shape that we want in our sleeve head that's going to match the curve that we have in the armhole. So again, in my case, I can't really get just one curve like that out of this ruler. I'm just going to have to kind of improvise it a little bit. And again, you can just do the same, just something like that. So there you go. There's just that nice flowing line there. And yeah, so that is our sleeve block. And again, I'll just mark it on more clearly so you can see what it is, which pieces we're really going to be working with from this. Okay, so what we have here now are 2 base blocks basically for both the sleeve and a shirt-like body covering garment. Now, if you want, you can keep these as your base blocks and just, you know, trace the patterns off directly off these, and then you can modify these and you can use these to expand out into not just this one shirt pattern, but into other patterns for similar garments. I actually don't have any tracing paper, so I am just going to basically go directly and make this into the pattern. I think it's easier just for me to do it that way, and then not, you know, keep referring back to this block that is like the Rosetta Stone, if you like. Just can't be bothered. Okay, so first thing I'm gonna do is cut out the sleeve, but then I'm gonna modify this directly, and I'll show you how to transform it from this basis, this template, into an actual functional shirt pattern. Okay, so I'm gonna work with this block as both the front and the back panel. Let's start with some of the things we're gonna be doing to it as the front panel. So we need first to establish the button stand, if you like, in the facing. So the center line here that we've already drawn in the pattern, that is corresponding to the line along which the buttons and the buttonholes are going to be. What we need now is to extend that out so that there's an edge. So again, this extends beyond here on my shirt, this imaginary central line where the buttonholes and buttons are. And then in addition to that, we also need a facing that's going to fold under and wrap around it. So that's these 2 lines here. And the first one is 1.5 centimeters out from the central line. And the second one, this facing line, is 3 centimeters further out from that first line. So overall, we've got 4.5 centimeters additionally added beyond that central seam here. So as I said earlier, I want to try and have my cake and eat it and basically make the modifications to this base block that will apply both to the front and the back panel. So I've done some for the front. I'm just going to do one for the back now. And as I said, the back of this shirt is going to be 5 centimeters longer than the front. So that's the bottom edge. That's my 75 centimeter distance that I was talking about when we were doing the measurements. I'm just going to add 5 centimeters down here on the bottom, literally just like that. So that's in the interest of my back piece. And then what I'm also going to do here is just going to choose a point relatively arbitrarily here, just a style point on the side seam. This is going to apply to both pieces because what I want to do is have it curving up from the front and the back up like that, and that's where the two pieces will meet rather than it just being sharp and straight. Let's call it 3 centimeters up here. And so what I then need to do is have this line curve down from this point to the center of the front panel, and then also again from this point to the center of the back panel. I'm just gonna more or less freestyle this. I'm not too worried. So let's call it that for the front piece and straighten out nice and early. Something like that for the back piece. Okay, so I've got those 2 things marked. And then just along those 2 lines as well, I just want to add 1.5 centimeters of hem allowance for obvious reasons. We need a hem, we need allowance for it. So let's do that. So again, on both the corresponding front and back panels. And if it looks a little bit confusing right now, don't worry, it's about to get less so, because we're soon gonna start dividing these out. You know what, I'm just gonna freehand this. This is some really delirious freehanding going on here, but. And just before I start cutting, I just need to add 2 more bits of seam allowance. So 1 centimeter in addition to the facing here. Wow, really taking it to the cutting edge. So like so. And then also 1 centimeter to this neckline here on the front piece. It's the facing going out there. And then just following that same curve that I drew on for the front neckline. Okay, I know this is all looking a bit busy, but it's about to become a lot clearer. So again, contained in this so far, what I've drawn is a template for both the front and the back panel. So I'm going to cut out everything that I've drawn here, trace it off, and then I'm going to reduce what I've traced to the back panel and then reduce this down to the front panel. And again, I think it will be clear then what I've been going on about all this time. So again, that's the back neckline. For now I need that, I don't want to cut away that. So again, already got my seam allowance here, so I don't need to worry about that. And again, so that is the hem allowance of the front. This is the hem allowance of the bottom. So I'm going to include both by cutting out the larger one. Again, assuming you have tracing paper at home, and I'm sure you do if you're into drafting patterns, I really don't know why I don't, you will have started with the first drafted bit that we did, you know, the bit that's marked out here in the darker felt tip pen, and you would have just traced off 2 copies of that, and you won't be actually working with this original panel itself. I'm just doing so because I don't have tracing paper and I don't want to waste paper, so I might as well just make this into one of the 2 panels of the front and the back. So again, I'll trace around this now to get what will become the back panel, and then I will trim this away into just the front panel, and again, it will hopefully be a bit clearer there what I've been doing all this time. Just weigh this down a little bit. So because obviously the back panel doesn't need this facing, I'm actually just going to fold this over, or indeed under like that, as if it was born to do it. And so we've already added the hem allowance to the back panel for the purpose of cutting out my hybrid panel, but there are still some other seam allowances and things like that that we need to add to the back panel, so we're not done with it quite yet. That's what I like about working with slightly heavier paper compared to tracing paper, is that it just has a little bit more resistance if you want to, you know, trace around it, or indeed if when you're cutting it out on the fabric, if you're trying to chalk around it, which is how I prefer to do it versus pinning the pattern to the fabric, then yeah, again, these sort of slightly thicker bits of paper just offer a bit more resistance to your chalk, your pencil, or whatever. Yeah, sweet. And now for clarity's sake, before I get started in, again, this is going to be the back panel, let us now complete the front panel based on this. So I'm trimming away everything here that only corresponded to the back panel. So that's 2 things basically. Remember, this is the back panel neckline and this is the front panel neckline. I don't need this, I just need that. So let's do like so. The back panel is longer than the front panel. Don't need this bit. So that is now the completed front panel of my pattern, or your pattern if you're following along exactly with me. Okay, so first thing I want to do is mark on the back yoke. So if you think about a shirt, I mean, I'm not going to lie on the table and show you on mine, but if you look on the back of a shirt, the back panel will often be divided into 2 pieces. The back yoke, which is the bit that runs from the neck down to roughly the mid-back, and then the rest of the panel. So I'm just going to not be especially scientific about this, just sort of pick a point. I guess let's go with that sort of 15 centimeters that we used from the nape measurement earlier. Actually, no, I don't like that. Let's go with something else. It's a bit too low, I think. Let's go with 2 centimeters above that. Not that one. These are going to get separated as 2 separate pieces. But first, I'm going to complete this one. So I need to add just some seam allowance to the neckline. But there's not going to be any seam allowance along here. So this is, if you were having 2 back panel pieces, this would be the center back seam. This would be the stitch line of that. But But what's actually gonna happen when you cut the fabric is you're gonna lay this on the fold, so this will eventually fold out and just be one continuous piece. So we don't need any seam allowance here whatsoever. So along the top of here, all I want is that 1 centimeter seam allowance for the neckline. And then this will already be ready to cut out. Again, you can see how precise I'm being. That's just my own devil's bargain with myself. You are more than welcome to do a better job. So I'm going to cut out this back yoke piece. So that's that. And obviously these two pieces will need to be re-sewn to each other. So I'll need to add some seam allowance here and some seam allowance here. So that's what sellotape's for. Taking a scrap bit of paper there, sticking it along the back of the yoke piece, and turning it over and just marking on that 1 centimeter excess beyond the original border. And then just cutting around that. And job done. So that's the finished back yoke piece. Except I'm looking at this now and I'm realizing that when I was first drawing my neckline originally, I think I didn't really curve this up enough. You see, I do want that to ultimately be curving up into the straight there so that it can round off into the front neckline, and it's just too sharp, it's too angular. So I'm just gonna add another little bit of scrap paper there. Let's just tape that up just a little bit. It's a large bit of scrap to add for that tiny little wedge, but it's worth it. Okay, so that's my finished back yoke piece. Okay, so now that we've sort of fixed the yoke, let's return to the main back panel. So all we really need to do now is, well, add that seam allowance, I'll get to that in a second, and then add a bit of allowance here for this back pleat. So again, if you look on the back of a lot of shirts, sort of casual work shirts, there'll be a sort of pleat in the center or maybe 2 on either side. I'm just gonna leave allowance for 1 in the center. So I'm just gonna add an extra inch or 2.5 centimeters here along the whole back. So that will now be the bit that is laid on the fold, the bit of the pattern that's laid on the fold when you're cutting it out. So all in all, there'll be an extra 5 centimeters of width in the back panel, but that'll get folded away in this pleat, or, you know, 2 smaller pleats if you prefer. It's kind of up to you. And yeah, ultimately you can add as many as you want, world's your oyster. And then going the 2.5 centimeters the other way on the back panel, I'm just gonna mark the notch for where that will kind of fold over, because this will remain essentially the center back seam and this will just be pleaty excess. This general width here needs to remain the same to match the yoke. So that'll become a notch in the pattern basically. And yeah, again, so that will fold over there when I'm actually constructing the shirt. So now to add that 1 centimeter seam allowance. In fact, it's gonna be easiest if I just cut this out first. So as before, just take your excess scrap paper, and as with the yoke, just mark on an extra 1 centimeter up here as your seam allowance. And yeah, just cut that away, and there you have it. That's your back panel. You got your pleat, you got your yoke, job done. Let's move to the sleeves. So again, if you have tracing paper, what you can do, or what you're maybe gonna do, is trace this off and then sort of mirror it. So you'll end up with one continuous sort of sleeve piece that's kind of butterflied out like this. I'm gonna trace around this, create a duplicate, and then stick them together, and you'll see what I mean. Righty. Okay, so again, I'm just gonna stick these together now, create the basis of one continuous sleeve piece. Again, if you can imagine you were tracing it, you would have just doubled it and created this in one solid block. Incidentally, it's a good time to check the curve at the top of your sleeve and make sure that it hasn't got this little, you know, little sort of tulipy divot in there. You just want to kind of smooth it out. If it has, you want to make sure that's one continuous curve and not dipping in. And this will basically become the point of your sleeve notch that will correspond to the shoulder seam when you're sewing it all together. Anyway, what's next? So first things first. So this is the full length of the sleeve, but if you imagine, obviously we're gonna have cuffs. So the sleeve itself doesn't need to be quite this long. So how long does it need to be? Well, for our cuffs, we're gonna have a width of 6 centimeters. So we're gonna reduce this by 6 centimeters. Although except in this case, because I'm only then gonna add on another centimeter back for a seam allowance for attaching it to the cuff, I'm just gonna reduce this by 5 centimeters, not 6. But you can reduce it by 6 centimeters if you want, if it's just a bit more easier doing it step by step that way, and then just add back on a centimeter later as your seam allowance. And that's gonna be my actual stitch line, as it were. Trim that. And so if you think about a cuff, obviously there's this sort of slit in it, so we need to locate that slit, and that's just going to basically be on one side and half the distance along here, basically from here to here. So in this case, put that here, and I want my slit there to be 10 centimeters long, going though from the stitch line, not the seam allowance. So including the seam allowance, that's going to be 11 centimeters up. Great. So, and that will again just be a sort of a notch point or a mark point that you're gonna mark on your pattern. You remember when we drafted this piece that to get this measurement from here to here, we did half of the wrist measurement plus 5 centimeters. Again, it was actually lower down than here, so it was slightly narrower there. But the point is we have an extra 5 centimeters of ease, in addition to the ease that's already in the pattern, to play with. And we're gonna use that to create some little pleats here. Or in this case, I'm just gonna do one. So the last thing I need to do to the sleeve pattern is just mark on where I want those to go. And yeah, I've just picked this spot here. So 5 centimeters there. So what will happen is I'll bring that point over to that point. So I'll just kind of snip that in as notches here. And yeah, that's basically it. That is the sleeve. So let's move on to the various accoutrements. We need a cuff, we need some little placket pieces, and we need obviously we need a collar, and indeed maybe a little pocket, something like that. So we'll go over that now. So let's start with the cuff. So first thing we need to do is just measure how big the cuff essentially needs to be. So I'm gonna measure this stitch line from here to here. So that's 31 centimeters, but obviously we have a centimeter of seam allowance here on either side. So that's -2 plus this 5 centimeters. So that's -7 centimeters overall. So that means we need a cuff of 24 centimeters, except it doesn't, because the placket itself, as you can kind of see here on this shirt, that fold there is where the edge of this placket slit is. And beyond that, there's another centimeter. And the piece I'm gonna draft to match that is also gonna have an extra centimeter. So we're taking that 24 centimeters and then we're gonna add another centimeter onto that to get the cuff width, okay? So that's 25 centimeters overall in my case. Width of the cuff is gonna be 6 centimeters. And yet, of course, we also want seam allowance. We want that on all sides. So I'm just gonna add a centimeter on every side of this rectangle, and that's our cuff. And as for things like button points and buttonhole points, because obviously there'll be a button and buttonhole on the cuff, I tend not to really mark those on. I tend to just sort of go by once I actually put the garment together, see where I want them. But obviously you can, if you want, you can already mark them on the pattern as you're making it. And incidentally, it's always good, you know, just to add the grain line, just for a reminder in case you need it when you're cutting out. Although in this case, everything's pretty, you know, up and down. Another thing to add is obviously this is for quite a sharply rectangular cuff. If you want to have like a bit more of a rounded edge there, you can do so. Just pick an edge basically and just round it off. In fact, yeah, let's do that. Why not? Sweet. There's my cuff. So like I said, I'm gonna want some plackets, some placket pieces to go here. I want the placket to extend 2 centimeters beyond the seam allowance in that slit, which is to say 1 centimeter beyond the slit itself. But I basically want it to have a visible width of 2 centimeters, which means it needs to be at least 4 centimeters wide, because obviously it's gonna fold under. And then it wants seam allowance on either side of that. So it's gonna be 6 centimeters wide. It needs to be at least 11 centimeters long to factor in the length of the slit plus the cuff. And it also wants to have obviously some extra seam allowance at the top as well. So there's gonna be 2 placket pieces, a sort of main one and then a sort of underside one. Just talking about the main one for now, because we'll orient the size of the smaller one based on this one. But if you see, what's gonna happen is there's gonna be this excess that will come out over the top and be folded under in some sort of, you know, patterned way, and then top stitch down. And that covers what on the inside, the base of that slit basically, and just helps it keep very secure. The point being that the slit itself is actually, you know, it stops somewhere down here maybe, and we need, you know, a few centimeters of excess there. So I'm gonna go with 6 centimeters wide, 11 centimeters long, but I'm gonna add, just for safety, I'm gonna add 4 centimeters, 15 centimeters by 6 centimeters. To be honest, you can just play around a bit and find what works for you. Cool, but anyway, so this is the main placket piece. Doesn't look like much. Let's draw the grain line on there, not least to help us remember this is not a random scrap of paper. And now again, based on this, I'm gonna draw the smaller placket piece, so the bit that's gonna be on the underside of the placket. Doesn't need to be as wide as this, doesn't need to be as long as it either. So I'm gonna subtract 2 centimeters from the 6 centimeters, because this is just gonna purely wrap around that edge of the slit. It's not gonna extrude any further. So that'll make it 4 centimeters wide overall. And then we don't need all that length. I'm gonna take off 2 centimeters from the length. So it'll be 13 centimeters long and it'll be 4 centimeters wide. Yeah, again, I mean, a lot of what I like to make are things like tailored garments. You know, I've made a couple of suits, things like that. And oftentimes when you're constructing that, you know, I don't necessarily have a pattern replete with all these tiny little bits, you know, like your pockets or your pipe pocket pieces or whatever it might be. Really just have the main pattern, and then I just cut out little scraps based on quoted measurements as I go for things like this. But, you know, for the sake of completion, we'll cut these out as part of the pattern. Anyway, there they are. And now let's say you want a pocket or multiple pockets. I'm just gonna draft a piece for 1 pocket. You can double it, or, you know, you can cut as many as you want and stick them wherever you want on your shirt, because you are drafting it and you're making it. It's your life, my friend. Vaguely working off the pocket that I'm wearing now, or the pocket on the shirt that I'm wearing now. I am wearing more than a pocket. I'm gonna go with 12 centimeters wide, 14 centimeters deep at the center, because I'm gonna do a little a little sort of diamond shape. So I'll measure down 14 centimeters from here. And then at the sides, it's just going to be 11 centimeters deep. Actually, no, let's go with 12. Let's go with 12. Obviously, you can do a flat bottom one if you want. You can do a rounded bottom one if you want. I am absolutely going on a whim here. Again, this is an instance of something where I wasn't doing this for sort of semi-instructional purposes. I was just making it myself. I wouldn't bother cutting out these patterns. I would literally just cut a scrap of fabric according to whatever I wanted to do. And so yeah, that's basically the pocket. We need some seam allowance. We want 3 at the top so that it can be folded under multiple times. And then, as before, just 1 centimeter around the other edges. And there is your patch pocket. Okay, let's draft the collar. So we're first going to draft a sort of one-piece collar and then expand it from there into a stand. But if you want, you can just take the one-piece collar and go and sew with that. That's also fine. First thing we want here is a line from a point 1 to point 2, and the length of that line is going to be half of your neck measurement. So in my case, 45 centimeters divided by 2, 22.5. From point 2, we're then going to extend off to point 3, further along this line, and that distance is going to be equal to the width of the button stand we added to the front of the shirt. So in my case, that was 1.5 centimeters plus another 1.25 centimeters. So that's seam allowance basically, or allowance for seam allowance, but just a little bit of excess because of how we're going to shape it, and also bits that might get lost when you're sewing it together. So what was that? That was 2.75 centimeters. Then we're going to mark 0.4, and that's 3/4 of the way along the line from 1 to 2. So that was 22.5 divided by 4, that is 5, let's call it 5.5. So 5.5 centimeters away from point 2. My mental arithmetic has really taken a nosedive over the years. Then we'll square up from these points here from 1, 2, and 3. So now I'm going to find 0.5 along this line, and that is going to be a point equal to the overall height of the collar stand and the, what's it called? Collar itself, yeah. So I'm gonna go with 9 centimeters here as the overall depth. Again, you could do more, you could do less, just depends how high or low, how large or small you want your collar, I guess. But I think something in the sort of 8 to 9 centimeter range is gonna be pretty standard. So yeah, let's go for 9 centimeters, but then we also wanna add 2 centimeters, because again, think about it, we're gonna have seam allowance here. So it's 11 centimeters overall. And wouldn't you know it, it's basically just where I put that line earlier. And 0.6 is going to come halfway along this line, which is, 5.5 centimeters either way. And now I'm going to square across here to points 7 and 8 that are going to intersect these two lines, squaring up from 2 and 3. So, and then just inwards from point 8, we're going to go 1 centimeter to find point 9. Then we're going to draw a line between 3 and 9 here. Along this line, we're going to find 2 points. We're going to find point 10, which is 0.75 centimeters up from 3. And down from 9, we're going to find point 11, which is the same distance away, 0.75 centimeters. And then going back to 1, we're going to go up half a centimeter to point 12. And this is just going to help us create a sort of more natural curve when we join these points all together, which is what we're going to do now. So starting at 12, we're going to draw a line that runs down through 4 and then back up to that 10 point there. What else are we joining up? 11 to 7. And then what we need to do here is, if you can imagine, so that's the collar stand, we need to have the actual shape of the collar here. So this now comes down to how pointy, how angular, how whatever, how do you want the shape of it to be? I'm not going for anything wild here. I'm just going to go for something relatively orthodox. So from point 7, just stretching out there a little bit. So a little bit higher than point 5. Come along like this straight at first. From 5, and then from maybe about there, just sort of angle that gently up. Okay, so that there, this shape, is a kind of one-piece collar that you can take, you can use, and you can already sew with it. You've got your seam allowance added in. Well, so this is going to be cut on the fold again, so there's no seam allowance along that edge, that's going to be cut on the fold, but there's 1 centimeter of seam allowance along all of these pieces. Again, there's a little bit more here just to allow for the bunching of the fabric that's going to happen when you sew that all together, because you're going to have 2 pieces of this, you'll need just that extra 1/4 centimeter seam allowance. So like I say, you can take that and go with it if you want, but why don't we detach these 2 pieces and make separate patterns for these? Because that is kind of a bit more akin to what you'd find on a shirt that maybe you've bought in shops and, just looks a bit more proper maybe. So we've got points 6 and 7 here. They were, 22.5 centimeters away from each other? Well, they should be, but whatever. A little bit of slippage. We want to find point 13, that's halfway between. So again, that's 11.25 centimeters. My poor table, I burrowed into that like a squirrel after a nut. And then what we want to do is actually want to lower the collar stand. So coming down from 7, we want to go down 1 centimeter, find point 14. And coming down from 11, we want to go down, again along that line, 1 centimeter to find point 15. Going from 13 to 15, we're just going to join those with a nice gentle curve. Obviously that curve, between 13 and 15 is supposed to go through 14. Silly old me. And then so having marked that collar tip point as point 16, we're going to join 14 and 16, again just in a gentle, natural, curvaceous way. Okay, so I'm now going to draw the outline of what we've got, because it's slightly different from what we had a minute ago. We've now got the outlines of 2 pieces. Okay, so you can see there now, we have 2 individual pieces, the collar stand and the collar piece itself. So as I mentioned with the individual collar piece, there was already all the necessary seam allowance added into that single piece. But obviously we've now created a seam here and there's no seam allowance currently factored in there. So first thing we need to do is cut out these individual pieces, or again, you can trace them off if you're working that way. Yep, and so we just need an extra centimetre of seam allowance along that edge and along this edge here. So just mark on that 1 centimetre extra here. So that's at the top of the collar stand. So that's at the top of the collar stand. But anyway, there you have it. That's the extra seam allowance you need on the bottom of the actual collar flap. Yeah, and we're done. Okay, so let's go over what we've got. We've got our collar stand, our collar bit, got a little pocket, got our cuff piece, got our 2 placket pieces, we've got our sleeve piece, got our back yoke, got the rest of our back piece there, and we have our beautiful, victorious front piece. So those are the ingredients you need for just a basic, you know, casual to work, men's shirt, that kind of thing. So one last note about seam allowance. So as I said, in lots of places, like around the sleeve and the shoulder and the side seams, the 1 centimetre seam allowance was already factored in when we were drafting the pattern. And where it wasn't, we've added it in extra, like around the neckline and so on and so forth. And then we also have our 1.5 centimetre hem allowance. So this 1 centimetre is adequate for just a plain seam, you know, right sides together, sew it together, overlock it, or finish the raw edges first, then sew it, you know, that kind of thing. If you wanted to do something a bit more fancy, like a flat fill seam or French seam or something like that, just be aware that you would then want to add at least another sort of 0.5 centimetres, another 5 millimetres onto your pattern, or you can just add that extra when you're cutting it out if you want. But for now, everything that's in this pattern that you will have just drafted, that's adequate to do just a plain stitch at 1 centimetre seam allowance, and yeah, should see you through. So that's your pattern. Not much to it, right? Of course, a handy thing about commercial patterns is that they usually also come with instructions. Now, if you do already have some instructions from another pattern to hand, then by all means get going, use your wits and apply them to one you've just made. The construction really shouldn't vary very much. Very. But if you don't sweat it. I'm very keen to get on and sew a few of these bad boys, so I will be doing my best to get a step-by-step video up on this channel next week. So if you haven't already subscribed, you can do so now and be sure not to miss it. And if it's already next week by the time you're watching this, then you'll find that tutorial here. There's a chance if you're watching this video that you're maybe something of a sewing beginner. Perhaps, as is normal with all beginners, you're feeling beset with worries about patterns, fabrics, instructions, really maybe any and all aspects of the sewing enterprise. If that is you, well, why don't we see if I can't help talk those worries away? And if it ain't, and you're a more seasoned sewist, then I'd still love to know your thoughts as well. Either way, thanks very much for watching and have a good one.